Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining me for another restful episode of true, scary stories to help you fall asleep. Today, we are going to be reading paranormal stories. Also, since the month of February is a shorter month, I wanted to fit a lot of collabs into my videos this month. We are going to be having collabs with people such as Phoenix Fire Narrations, The Grim Reaper's Nightmare, Inner Scare Wifey, Entropic Society, as well as others who you may not have heard of. So, for today's video, we are being joined by Horror Over Coffee. His link will be in the description down below. I also want to mention that recently I have updated the merch on my merch store, and I have changed merch providers. So, if you want to check out some of our merch, make sure to do so in the link in the description down below as well. But now, without further ado, lay back, relax, and enjoy these true paranormal stories.
Before I moved to London, I used to live in a 1950s built house in Hampshire, UK. My parents had purchased it in '99 from an old couple who had lived in it since it was built, so no one had died in it. The first strange thing that happened was that the cats wouldn't stay in the house. They would always bolt out for some reason. After my parents started renovating, my brother and I both started to feel like we were being watched in the house, and at night in the living room, you would always feel like something was watching you through the new glass doors from the hallway or the stairs. After a while, if we were sitting downstairs, we started to hear footsteps moving from my bedroom in the room above, walking to my brother's neighboring room, then across the landing to the hallway to my parents' room. My parents both dismissed it as the pipes cooling or the floorboards settling, but you could distinctly tell exactly what boards the footsteps were treading on. At one point, friends came over. I was alone, and as you walked down the street, you could see into our living room. They asked if I had relatives staying over, as they had seen people sitting on the sofa. Then, things started to move. You'd place shoes by the door, and then they'd be under the stairs, or things like keys would be moved somewhere else. Then, it gets really creepy. One day, I had run a bath, and was listening to music on the computer in the study in the next room. It had been a while, and the music had stopped as the PC has gone onto standby mode. I had been in the bath for about an hour, and fell asleep, and as the water had just gone past my nose, the music on the PC shot back on, louder, and woke me up, saving me from potentially drowning. I took this to be that whatever was in the house wasn't bad. However, a few weeks later, I woke up bolt upright, like something had woken me up. Must have been around 2 a.m. My door was wide open onto the landing, and it was a bright full moon night, shining through the hallway onto the brick landing. I looked, and to my terror, I saw an old man, but he wasn't standing up. It was like he was laying down on the stairs, and his head was at foot height, staring around the landing wall, directly at me. The moonlight was on his face. It haunts me to this day. I closed the door and slept with my light on for the rest of the night. My parents sold the house in 2004 when they moved to New Zealand, and when I spoke to my dad about it later, he said he knew something was in the house, but hadn't want to scare my brother and I. He'd had his own experiences. He'd hear these same footsteps on the floorboards in the mornings when he'd get up and make tea for my mom. He'd hear footsteps behind him in the kitchen, walking towards him, something brushing past him, and taps would turn on by themselves. Years later, when I told him about the old man I'd seen, he said on a few occasions he'd been in the lounge at night, and in the reflection of his reading glasses, he could see the exact same man sitting in the armchair behind him. My dad is a massive skeptic, a policeman back in the day, and a no-nonsense project director. Apparently, he was so freaked out, he went to the public records office to see what our house had been built on. The area had been made up of old mansion estates back in the Victorian times, and it looks like our kitchen had been built over a pathway leading from the big house to an ice house outbuilding. He thinks maybe it was the servants or whoever walked that path. Very spooky.
Last summer, I was fortunate enough to be able to go on an investigation at Missouri State Penitentiary, and it was a blast. I don't know the specific tour I went on as I wasn't in charge of booking it, but we got to go through several of the buildings and had a couple of encounters as well. The first encounter was in the showers of one of the holding areas. Our guide lit up a cat ball and tossed it into the shower, and it lit up a shadow onto the wall of the shower, which was so cool to see. The second encounter was much more intense. We were in the death row section of the prison, in a basement, and our guide was trying to get some of the spirits there to show themselves, and they wouldn't. So, to draw them out, our guide began to talk about something unrelated to the tour, and we looked towards the end of the hallway towards the only source of light, and a shadow figure began to slowly creep out from behind the wall, leading around to the other side of death row. It was such a surreal experience to see that. I don't know how many people end up seeing this, but if you read through, I can 100% recommend MOSP. I'll be in Sally House soon, and I'm so excited to be staying the night there. I've experienced many odd and unexplainable things in my life, but this event has been on my mind for a few years now, and I finally decided to tell it. And I pray that I'm not the only one who's experienced something like this. So let's start from the beginning. I graduated from high school in 2019 and was promoted to supervisor for a kitchen in a nursing home down the street. Since I oversaw dinner, I didn't start work until about 3:30 p.m., and we get home around 10 p.m. So for the first half of the day, I would be completely home alone. I enjoyed that time. Solitude was always nice, especially when you're as introverted as I am. Normally, I would sleep until about noon, but this time I decided to relax on the couch in our main living room and watch Kitchen Nightmares. I remembered nodding off and falling into a light sleep, so any small noise would wake me up. The first few times I cracked my eyes open, it would be just from the cats jumping on me. So when I felt the cushion by my feet dip a bit, I figured it was my cat, Peach. After a moment, I opened my eyes and realized my younger sister was sitting on the end of the couch, her back to me. I was half asleep, so I really didn't think much of it. I figured she just stayed home from school sick, so I just asked her if she could move her head so I could see the TV, but she ignored me. Still facing the TV screen, annoyed, I asked her why she was home. Once again, she remained silent, coming to the conclusion that she was just being rude. Again, I closed my eyes and fell back asleep. After about another hour, I got up and started to get ready for work, and noticed my sister wasn't in the room or in the house. Concerned, I called her. After trying to call her a few times and getting nothing, I called my mother. She picked up and I asked her if Sis told her where she was going. My mother, confused, asked me what I was talking about. She dropped my sister off at school before going to work. My sister had been at school this whole time. In shock, I hung up and kept this to myself, convinced I was losing my mind. That it was all in my head. But I remember that moment so vividly. What my sister was wearing, how she was sitting, how I felt a shift on the couch when she sat down. This wasn't a dream. This was real. It had to be. There was something in my house with me that morning, and it was not my sister. I kept this experience to myself. As a kid, I had what my parents called a very active imagination, always seeing things, hearing things, and being easily spooked. So I think it got to a point where I just convinced myself this whole experience didn't happen, and that there was some rational explanation. It actually took me a few years to tell my little sister about this. Once again, mostly out of fear of being perceived as crazy, and I didn't want to spook my sister. But something she said to me changed that real fast. This takes place in September of 2022. My sister and I were waiting in line for a ride at a local amusement park. Every year, my dad's workplace would rent the whole park for employees and their families. We spent most of the day together as a family. But about an hour before closing, Sister and I went to the back of the park to ride some night rides. So it was just the two of us, and the waiting was getting terribly boring. Sis and I weren't very close, and don't have much in common, so we struggled to have a conversation and for the most part just stood in silence. But out of the blue, she spoke up. "Kat, want to hear something freaky?" As a lover of all things spooky, that caught my attention, so I immediately replied with an eager yes. And a part of me wishes that I said no. My sister is a night owl, and over the summer would stay up until 6 a.m. I had just started working a different job after quitting my nursing home position. That's another scary story for a different day. So I was starting to go to bed at 12 a.m. every night and would be up around 10 a.m. So she would be the only one awake. One night, she noticed light coming from the crack in her bedroom door, and she heard both my voice and our mother's voices talking. Only it was hard to understand, as if we were either speaking too quickly or just complete gibberish. She quickly grabbed her phone, checking the time, and her confusion only grew when she noticed that it was 3 a.m. What were we doing awake? Sometimes my mom and I would go to the front window, if the weather was bad during the night, to keep an eye on the storm, or if there were sirens. We both have a bad habit of being very nosy, so she figured that's what was going on. After a few minutes, she could still hear the voices and still see the lights. Growing curious, she got out of bed and opened her bedroom door and rushed into the hall, expecting to see me and my mother by the window talking. Only that's not what she saw. There were no lights on. It was completely dark besides the illumination from her phone screen, and there was no one in sight. Not our mother, not me. Not even the cats were out there. Unsettled and confused, she turned to my bedroom door thinking I was messing with her. She opened my door and I was asleep with both cats. She goes back in the hall. Mom and Dad's bedroom door is also shut. She peeks in there and both are sleeping. Now my sister is a rational person. She was always the one to go in the basement first, tell the others that monsters and ghosts aren't real. So she completely pushed this event out of her mind, because in her eyes it wasn't a big deal. Maybe she was just overtired, or our grandfather's TV downstairs was a bit loud and that's what she heard. But like my own experience, this kind of sat in the back of her head, and the house grew to be a little less comfortable. She mentioned how after that she felt like there was always someone watching, as if they were tucked in a corner just observing her. She wasn't scared out of her mind, just a bit confused. When she told me that, a pit in my stomach opened up and I had chills. I laughed at first because, come on, we were in public and I didn't want to flip out. So we went on the ride, and for the remaining time that the park was open, we pushed that conversation onto the back burner. On our way to meet up with our parents, we started talking about it again, and I finally told her about what happened to me, how I saw her at home that day, spoke to her, and could remember what she wore. That was the first time that I saw her get scared. I wasn't home, she kept saying. What do you think it was then? We still don't know. We don't know if we want to know. The only thing we are sure of is there is something in our house. So this is my first time posting a story. This was a few years back when I was still high school aged. It was during the summer, and I remember that if only because of how hot it had been that day. I had gone to sleep in thin PJs with my fan going full blast to keep me cool during the night. Next thing I know, I'm waking up, and I looked at my alarm clock. It had been 2:40 something a.m. when I got up to drink some water because I was parched. I had just stepped out of my room and opened my eyes, because I had been rubbing them to wake up a little more before I paused. My nightlight was on. Yes, I use a nightlight, so what? And there was something in front of me, sucking up the light from it, say about 5 feet away. It was tall, black, and had what looked like some type of hat on. I'm pretty sure it was a fedora because of the way it tipped. And I just froze up for a bit while staring at it before flicking on the hallway light, because I could feel the hairs on the back of my neck raise the longer I stared at it. Once I had flicked the lights on, it was gone. But I have never in my life felt so terrified before or since. Are those types of shadow people dangerous or something? This story is from about 4 to 5 years ago. So this story begins when I was going to college for automotive. I shared an apartment with 3 other guys in my class. It had 2 floors. The main floor had the living room and the kitchen, and the upper floor had the bedrooms. We all worked jobs and at different hours of the day, so at any given time there was maybe 2 of us in the apartment at a time. But most of the time I was in the apartment by myself because of my work schedule. When I was home alone, I would hear footsteps upstairs, when I would be in the kitchen cooking food, or in the living room watching TV or playing games, or when I was upstairs in my room studying. I would hear voices from downstairs. Most of the time I would stop what I was doing and look around to see if my roommates were home, but I wouldn't find anyone in the apartment. When this all started happening, I asked all my roommates if they had heard anything in the apartment when they were home alone. They all had similar experiences. We all sat and talked about it for a little bit before we went to bed for the night. It was about a week or 2 after we all sat down and talked about it, and things started to get more weird. We would be woken up in the middle of the night by knocks and other noises. We also started to wake up with random scratches on us, and some of my roommates started to get angry for no reason at all. So another roommate and I decided to sage the apartment. As we were doing it, I was recording on my phone. When we got done, we left the apartment for a bit, and I left my phone on a table to record while we were gone. When we got back to the apartment, it had a different feeling than it did before we left, a more calming feeling. So we went to bed. It wasn't till the next morning that I went over the recordings on my phone after I transferred them to my computer. I was shocked on what I found on the recordings. As I was listening to them, I found some EVPs saying things like, "Look, here, go away, stop, leave," and more. Shortly after that, we all moved out of the apartment into a new one. And to this day, I have no idea what was or still is in that apartment. Okay, I'm not an expert. What I'm about to tell is 100% real, and if my suspicions are true, I even have photo evidence. This is very fuzzy, because this has been happening to me ever since I have the notion of memory. I have to first tell you that I didn't get baptized until I was 9 years old. That's because when my parents tried to do it for the first time, when I was a little child, my grandpa died that exact same day. Ever since, it's normal for me to get sleep paralysis, and to get nightmares in which demons and evil ghosts want to hurt me. Even my father has many anecdotes of me waking up at night panicked, saying something attacked me, only for when I get in the room again to go back to sleep peacefully. The thing is, only my father remembers these times, so I can confidently say that they're sleepwalking episodes. And ever since I was a little kid, I had days, even weeks, in which even if I slept enough, I didn't feel as if I rested. I don't have energy those days. That's all for the sleep part. Now, for the I'm awake part. I don't feel alone many times when I actually am. Even my puppy cries a lot, and my cat chases a lot of invisible things. Heck, when I was a kid, I believed the tooth fairy was real because one day, when one of my baby teeth fell off, I saw my cat chasing something I couldn't see. Something new that happens to me ever since last year is that I get scratches, and I don't even know how. And it happens when I'm awake. It's strange. It's being okay and then suddenly feeling a sharp pain and seeing the scratch on my hands. I have one right now. I can take photos if necessary. And for last, I have an impossible shadow on a photo I made this summer. I didn't notice it until now. Is all of this just paranoia? Thank you for your time. This is a rewrite/repost of a story that I previously had posted here and later deleted. For some reason, I periodically go through and remove all of my stories. Then later, I might rewrite them. This happened one evening in the summer of 1984 or thereabouts. I was a teenager walking around with 3 friends in the general area of the suburban neighborhood where we all lived. There wasn't a lot to do, so it was common for kids our age to stroll around at night, talking, laughing, and getting into minor mischief. There was a large area of several acres sort of in the middle of a few neighborhoods. It was surrounded by houses on 3 sides and a large empty field, an elementary school, and some municipal buildings on the 4th side. There was a narrow asphalt path that ran through the middle of the area, presumably to provide a way for kids to walk to and from the school. The whole area was referred to as the Path. It had a reputation amongst the kids as a scary and dangerous area. In my mind as a child, the Manson family, or the Shrewsbury equivalent, was living there, holding satanic rituals and sacrificing kids like me. In reality, the scariest thing was older kids smoking pot in the woods or making out in shady, leafy hollows. So on this particular evening, it was Frank, Keith, Brian, and me wandering around aimlessly. We decided to walk down a dead-end street and cut through the yards into the woods of the path. It was dusk, the light fading completely as we cut through one of the yards, over an old stone wall, and into the dense underbrush. We didn't have a flashlight, and the only way we could see where we were going was to spark the flint wheel on an empty Bic lighter one of us had. It provided a quick, dim strobe flash by which we could get our bearings. We picked our way single file through the underbrush to a narrow flowing brook. There was a fallen log across the stream, so it was a quick 1-2 step to cross the brook. On the other side of the brook, as we knew from playing in the woods, was a narrow dirt path that ran perpendicular to and intersected with the main asphalt path off to our left, maybe 100 yards away. To the right, the path continued through the dense brush and made a 90-degree turn and traversed a slight rise through a forested area, ending in the large field by the school. One by one, we quick-stepped across the log, over the stream, and pushed through the bushes onto the overgrown dark narrow path. I was third in line, Frank and Keith having gone first. As I emerged from the brush, and as Brian was making his way across, I heard Keith's voice, shrill and frightened. "There's someone standing right there." Frank and Keith were off to my left, facing in my direction. I whipped my head to the right, and sure enough, there was a man standing there not 6 feet from me. It was just a dark shape. A man-shaped blotch, darker than the darkness surrounding us. No question a man was standing there. I could make out the round brim of the hat. The figure was silent, unmoving. As I stared in terror, the figure moved slightly, maybe turning or raising an arm. Somehow my impression of this was not movement, but a subtle change in the shape of the silhouette. We broke and ran in a panic, truly scared but laughing and hooting hysterically, leaving poor Brian behind. We reached the asphalt path, Brian arriving a few seconds behind us. He hadn't seen a thing. As we stood panting and jabbering under the streetlight at the south end of the path, we compared what we had seen. Frank and Keith concurred with what I had seen, a man in a hat. Keith said, "When I was looking at it, it sort of changed." That gave me goosebumps, since that was the same subjective observation that I had made. Brian didn't see a thing. The dirt path was very overgrown, with weeds and bushes all but obscuring it. It was disused by that point, so it wasn't easy going, and wasn't a route one would take as a reasonable choice, especially at night. That is what made it particularly frightening to encounter someone standing silent and motionless, exactly where we happened to emerge onto the other path crossing the brook. Who was it? And why were they just standing there? How did they get there, and why didn't they speak to us? Why were they wearing what appeared to be a farmer's hat? All of these things flashed quickly through my mind when I saw the figure. My impression was that of a slim man in his 30s or 40s, about 5'8" to 10 inches. Was it one of the residents of the neighborhood who, perturbed by the obnoxious teenagers cutting through his yard, had somehow silently and quickly threaded his way through the dense, dark underbrush in order to menacingly glower at us in silence? It could have been. And if so, that in itself is terrifying. Bravo on scarring us for life. I'm still in touch with Frank, and we still talk about that experience from time to time, nearly 40 years later, and it still gives me chills to recall the encounter. Many years ago, I lived in an old house. We had many spooky encounters there. This is the brief story of one such encounter. One night, I awoke sometime in the wee hours in the dark bedroom. I saw movement to my right and turned my head and saw the dark silhouette of an arm sticking straight up from the bed. The hand was bent at the wrist, dangling, with fingers fanned out and limp. The arm and hand was slowly waving back and forth. I assumed it was my wife, perhaps dreaming. I watched, somewhat disturbed at the strange behavior and motion. I reached my hand out to gently grab her arm and wake her up, and to my surprise, there was only air. The silhouette faded away. Startled and frightened, I called out her name. She sleepily answered me. I felt the covers in her arms were both completely underneath. It took me quite a while to get back to sleep. Another time, my wife woke up and looked over to see the silhouette of me sitting up in bed next to her. She asked me what I was doing, waking me up to groggily respond to her. When she heard my voice come from the bed instead of head level of the sitting figure, she was similarly startled and frightened. Quite a few things have happened in that house. I lived in Chicago for a while now. A few years ago, I lived in Hyde Park in an old classic Chicago-style walk-up. Front sunroom, long unit, one of 4 on a single floor. Anyway, one night I was asleep in bed with my boyfriend and our pup was on the floor. I tend to wake up throughout the night, but the kind of wake you have in the morning. I just drift awake and then work to get back to sleep. However, this night I was sound asleep. Not even dreaming, I was so deep in my sleep. And I felt something freezing cold touch my foot and it startled me awake. Like tunnel vision and hyper-awareness immediately. It felt like a hand that had been bare out in the cold. So cold, it almost felt wet. Immediately, the thought of an elderly white woman with frazzled medium-length hair and small bony hands popped into my head. It took me a second to pull myself all the way together, but I was definitely startled awake. Logically, I want to say it was just my dog's wet nose, but my feet were under the covers, and I remember my dog being asleep. I have no idea what it was. I suppose I don't know if it was real, but it's still one of the freakier, very possibly paranormal experiences I've had in my life. Although, I figure since I'm here, I might as well share the only other potentially paranormal encounter seared into my brain. Growing up, I used to hear the shower doors in my bathroom rattle at night. Never during the day, only at night. Our house was built in the late 1800s or maybe early 1900s, like 1895 to 1910. I had these beautiful sliding glass doors as cover for my step-in bathtub shower, clearly a remodel done in the 60s. But at night they would shake, and when I asked my dad, he said 3 things on 3 separate occasions. It's probably just the house settling. It's probably just the trains. The trains were about a mile away, and I'm unsure how frequently they ran. And when I asked him again as an adult, he said, "I'm not sure what that could have been." And in response to me bringing up his prior answers, he said, "No, neither of those makes sense. That's ridiculous." Jokingly. Must have been ghosts. I don't know. Let me know if you have explanations for either of these. Because right now, I'm pretty dang sure that I know what it is. I worked at a psych facility for teens. My first week, we had a breaker throw, and it was going to take maintenance 3 hours to get to us. I volunteered to go to the basement and flip through the breakers. None of the other staff would go to the basement. Should have been my first clue. I get down there, and I'm looking over all the breakers, and this man's voice sounds behind me. "What are you doing?" Thinking it's maintenance, and I just didn't hear him come down the stairs. That creak loudly. I turned around and met with no one. I can't find the flipped breaker, and go back upstairs and asked if anyone else went down. Nothing. No one. Everyone was accounted for. This was the first time I encountered something there. Next was the overpowering smell of gardenias, or gardenia perfume. I would get sick or dizzy than smell it. Some of the kids had similar experiences, as well as the staff. The overnight staff was supposed to be one at one end of the house, and another at the other end. I was in the living room sitting where I could see the basement door, and saw hands, like at least 3 to 4 pairs of hands reaching and clawing out from the bottom of that door. Another night, I was sitting at the other end of the house and hear something upstairs. I go to the bottom of the stairs and see red glowing eyes. I stared at it and hissed, "Leave them alone." It growled at me, and the eyes lifted to a standing position, then disappeared. I had a kid. He was 17, a week away from discharging, and had a college scholarship. Not likely to make up stories. We were playing hide and seek. The kids would hide while 1 to 2 staff watched to make sure that they all hid separately, and one staff was the seeker. I was the seeker, and went to find one of the kiddos. I saw some in one of the bedrooms go from standing to hiding in the closet. There was a blanket that looked like a person under it. I pulled it up and nothing was under it, but something black streaked across my vision into another bedroom. The kiddo who was hiding in the other closet comes out, and then stares at me wide-eyed. I heard someone say, "Got you," then touch my shoulder. "It wasn't you, was it?" I didn't allow the kids to hide upstairs anymore. Another overnight shift. I'm in the living room again, and I see this black shadow of a man, at least 6 foot, turn the blind corner. We had one of those mirrors to see. I saw him in the mirror. Then I see him in the window in the kitchen, and then finally walk out through the side door. We had electrical issues with doors unmagging. All doors had to be locked where the kids couldn't leave without staff knowing or allowing it, and crazy family members couldn't enter willy-nilly. Yeah, they tried. They fixed it, but it would happen at least once a month to more. Several times when I would get off at 11 p.m. or midnight, I would see someone in my back seat as I was leaving. I would calmly say, "You aren't welcome here," or "You cannot come with me." This entity would disappear. One time I felt something latch onto my back. The creepiest feeling. It took about 15 minutes to get it off, with prayer before I left the drive. During my time working there, I had several miscarriages. Normal for me. I had a medical problem which is now resolved. Many nightmares. Developed major anxiety. Became paranoid. And my insomnia worsened. After I finally quit, I lost a whole bunch of weight that I had packed on. Almost weighed 200 pounds at 5'3". Normally I weighed closer to 130. And got pregnant successfully almost a year later. Crazy enough, I didn't quit because of the demons/ghosts. I quit because a past kid unalived himself. I couldn't handle knowing that no matter how much we helped, sometimes it didn't help. I went to work at an assisted living instead, where if the patients died, they had had a long life. Usually, a long, happy, fulfilled life. What I'm about to tell you is my encounter with a being that baffles me to this day. I'm aware that this could have been a dream, but if that's the case, then it's the most vivid and realistic dream I've seen in my lifetime. I was around 7, living with my father in the outskirts of Guatemala City. I would have a room for myself, with a window that faced the inner yard. One morning, I was casually lying in my bed, Watching TV, and as kids usually do, I did not want to get up yet. At some point, I realized someone was intently looking at me from the corner of the window. It was an old lady shrouded in black clothes. I was frightened and couldn't tear my eyes away from her. At some point, she retreated, and when I got up to see the yard, I could see her making her way for the kitchen. No tenants, let alone an elderly lady, lived in the same house at the time. I don't claim this was a ghost. I don't even know if this was real, so you may take it with a grain of salt. But whatever the explanation, the terror that I felt was real. I rented a house in El Paso, Texas. This is a very long post, but it's worth the read. Anyway, back in 2011, I was living in El Paso, Texas, for a year with my 2 sons. It was a nice place with a huge backyard for our dogs and 3 bedrooms, 2 dens, and a 2-car garage. Great place for the price I was renting it. Also, the landlord lived almost across the street from me, so he was always close by if needed. Shortly after moving in, a matter of weeks, I was in my bedroom watching TV and unwinding from a long day. I was unemployed at the time and had received a severance check from my ex-employer and was living off of that while I was job searching. My bedroom was right across from the hall from my youngest son's bedroom, and my older son had his bedroom next door to mine, as he was disabled and there were times I would have to get up in the middle of the night if he needed to use the bathroom. Late that night, I heard singing coming through the AC vents and assumed it was my son's girlfriend, who had just moved in with us and had a great singing voice. I chalked it up to that and told myself that I would speak to my son about it in the morning. The following morning, I asked my son about it, with his girlfriend there, and he told me that he thought the singing was coming from my room. They thought maybe I was watching something on TV and just turned up theirs to block out the song. Weird. This house was an older house, built in 1959, and built in an L shape, with one side of the L having bedrooms and bathrooms, and the other side had the den, dining room, kitchen, another room that could be used as an office or spare bedroom, and ended with the garage. All doors and windows had wrought iron. It started that when we would leave the house, we would lock the wrought iron door going into the house from the garage, and many times upon our return, the door would be unlocked. The same happened when we were in the house. The door would remain unlocked while we were inside the house, but many times I would have to go to the garage and the door would be locked. Also, this house had been renovated. It had new tile, carpet, cabinets in the kitchen and such, but certain rooms had these old-style push-button light switches. They would be lit if the lights in the room were off, and then you would push it and the switch would make a loud, audible double click. It sounded like ka-chunk, and the lights would turn on. In the hallway, the guest's bathroom light started turning on at different times of the night, but only when we were awake. We could be watching TV in the den and you would hear the click, and the light in the bathroom would be on. No one was around when it did this, and we could find no reason for it to be doing this. I remember shortly after we had moved, I had a brother over to help me connect all of my devices to connect a new Wi-Fi modem. After he got done setting everything up, it was dark outside and he asked me where the bathroom was. I told him first door on the left down the hallway. I heard him go in, press the light switch, ka-chunk, and as I heard him relieving himself, that house was not that big of a house, I heard the loud ka-chunk again, and then my brother screamed out, "What the F?" He flushed and came out. We told him we all heard it, and told him that it was happening on a regular basis. As we were still settling in at that house, I bought a touch-sensitive lamp that I could place on the table next to my son's hospital bed, so that those times that he called me late at night, I could just go in and tap the lamp and have light in his room. From off, if you touched the light once, it would light dimly, or low. The second touch would be brighter, medium. A third touch would put the light at its brightest setting, and of course, the fourth touch would turn it off again. Well, after about a week that this light was there, it started to turn on in the middle of the night. But It always seemed to turn on between 12 a.m. and 2 a.m., and it always was on the second medium setting, never the low or the high setting. There was no way that my disabled son would have been able to reach that light, as it was to the left of his bed and out of range of his hands and arms. He's had limited range of motion in his arms after his car accident. This light turned on every night without fail. There were several times that I would try to stay awake just so that I could catch the light turning on and run into the room to catch our invisible culprit. It never worked. I could be sitting up in bed with my door open watching for the hallway to brighten from the light being turned on. I was never able to catch it. As soon as I would start to doze off and close my eyes, I would snap awake and the light would already be on. At this time, I downloaded a Ghost Hunters app on my iPhone to test some things out. The night I was walking around the house trying to get EMF readings. They were on highest in my son's room. My brother was over again that night and told me it was probably picking up the electrical current from the wiring in the walls. So we decided to kill all power to the house at the main fuse box and to check the room again. Even with the power turned off, the EMF readings were on high in the guest bedroom and highest again in my disabled son's room. One night, I had my girlfriend staying over, and that night after we had our fun, we opened the door to my room so if my son called I could hear him. We went to sleep. I woke up to her screaming, yelling that someone was at the door. I looked, and sure enough, there was a shadow figure at the door. I'm getting goosebumps typing this. I jumped out of the bed as I saw it move to the left of the door and ran into the hallway. From there, I saw the shape go into the bathroom, the same one that had the light being turned on by itself. I turned on the light, my hands shaking, and the room was empty. I could not get my girlfriend to go back to sleep, and she packed up her stuff and left. The next day, I decided to go across the street to speak with my landlord and tell him the things that were happening. It was then that he told me that he had bought the house after the woman that had lived there had passed on. She died in the house. And he bought it and turned it into a rental property, and I was the first tenant at that house. After I told him all of the things that were happening, he told me that he was willing to rent a video camera that we could set up in my son's room. I told him maybe, that we would just see how things progressed as no one had been harmed, and whatever it was in that house did not seem malevolent in any way. As weeks turned into months, and each night passed, meant me waking up in the middle of the night to turn off the light in my son's room, as it would wake me up eventually. The doors around the house would lock and unlock themselves. The light in the bathroom would turn on and off, etc. We kind of got used to it. One night I was asleep in my room. I had the AC on, and the ceiling fan on in my room as El Paso summers can get hot as hell. Anyway, I was asleep and was awakened by the sound of the vertical blinds knocking against themselves. I wrote it off as the air being moved by the fan and the AC. I closed my eyes and was just about to doze off again when I felt the hair on the back of my neck stand up. I closed my eyes tighter and told myself, "Don't look." As soon as I thought that, I felt breathing on my right ear, and as plain as day something whispered, "Mother," into my ear. I yelled and jumped out of bed and turned on my lights, and nothing. There was no one there. As time moved on, I started dating another woman with 3 kids, and when things started to get serious between her and I converted the room that could be used as an office to a spare bedroom, with a set of bunk beds and another small bed for this girlfriend's youngest daughter. As they would come over and start spending weekends with us, they started experiencing things too, mostly the shadow figure. The little girl was the one that would see this the most, get scared, and come into our room and jump into bed with us. All of us had experiences with the shadow, as we started to call it. There were times I would be in watching TV in the den, and I would feel the hair on the back of my neck stand up. I would spin around, only to catch a dark streak moving away, and in a second it was gone. Anyway, as our 1-year lease was coming to an end, I contacted the El Paso Paranormal Society and asked if they could come out and check out the house. I called them, sent an email via their website, and never got an answer. My girlfriend and I got married. This did not last, but that's another story. And we ended up buying a house in the same neighborhood, only about 3 blocks from this one. As we were almost done with our move, I was finally contacted by the El Paso Paranormal Society. Needless to say, they were anxious to come check out the house and wanted to set up an appointment about 2 weeks from the day of their call. I told them we were already moving to a new place and that we would not be living there any longer by the time they would be able to come out. So the guy I spoke to told me, make sure that the last thing that I do when I leave this house for the final time would be announce to whatever was in that house that it needed to stay there and that it was not allowed to follow me. His telling me this gave me chills, but I said, okay, sure. That night, as me and my girlfriend were getting the last things out of that house, we did a final walkthrough, making sure all the lights were off, the doors locked, etc. The landlord had already been over to inspect and just asked us to leave a light on in the house. We chose to leave the light on in the kitchen, as it had a window with vertical blinds that looked out into the driveway of the house. This way, it would seem as if someone was home. As my wife and I got into each of our own cars and had our windows down and were speaking to each other, I remembered what the ghost hunter guy had told me. I yelled over to my wife to hold on a sec. I got out of my car, unlocked and opened the front door, and stood in the doorway and said, whatever is in this house, this is now your house. You are not allowed to follow us. You must stay here. I backed out of the house, closed and locked the door, and got back into my car. I yelled over to my wife, let's go. When all of a sudden, right in front of both of us, we saw one of the vertical blinds in the kitchen window move sideways as if someone was looking out. I'm getting chills again. We looked at each other and said, let's get the F out of here, and we left. I almost left out one of the creepiest things. There was one morning that I awoke very early, like 4:30-ish, and that dang light was on in my son's room again. I always tried to catch the light and turn it off before it woke my son, as due to his brain injury. Sleep was very important for him to have. As I walked in quietly to turn off the light, I was pissed that this had been going on so long and nightly. I tapped the light twice to turn it off and started to walk out of the room. I stopped at the foot of my son's hospital bed and said out loud, if there is something in here, turn on that effing light. And almost immediately the light turned on. I did not realize that my son, who I thought was asleep at the time, had woke up. The look of terror on his face shook me to the core. To this day, I still have nightmares about that morning and the look on his face. After that morning, I unplugged that lamp and put it away in the garage. Still, like I said, there were other things that occurred here, but this post would be easily 10 times what I posted to even begin to touch on most of it. The house is real. It's located at 2921 First Street in El Paso, Texas. You can Google it and see it looks like a normal house. You can even see the kitchen window that is close to the driveway that had that single vertical blind pushed sideways that last night there. Update. Now for the kicker. Since I made the original post, I have been contacted by 2 persons that knew this house and knew the couple that lived there. As mentioned earlier, the woman that lived there previously died in that house. What I did not know was that she died and stayed in that house undiscovered for a little more than a week. Eventually, the police were called by one of the persons that had contacted me about my original post to do a wellness check due to mail and newspapers starting to pile up, and no one answering the door when they would knock. After the police gained access to the house, she was found dead in the hallway between my son's room and the bathroom with the light that would turn on and off at all times of the night. Also, I was told that this lady lived in the house and became very angry and hateful as she grew older. She was paranoid and developed dementia. She became so hateful and cruel that she alienated all of her family, even her husband, who eventually moved out and paid the bills while she lived there alone. When he passed, the husband, this lady kept the urn with his ashes on the kitchen table that looked out onto the front driveway. The same window that had the vertical blind pushed sideways as if someone/something was looking out at me and my wife, at the time, on our last night at that house when we moved. I was told that the room that my son slept in, that as the lady suffered more and more from dementia, she made a shrine of sorts, with paper after paper taped to the wall, asking God to save her, to not hate her, to forgive her, for her family to love her. This same wall, when my son was set up in that room, had his medals from track and cross country, pictures of his friends, newspaper articles. I was even told by this same person that when she was younger, one of this lady's daughters told her, this neighbor witness, when this daughter was a child, that she did not like to be in that room because a dark smoke came out of the outlet at night. The same outlet that my son had his touch lamp plugged into. This means that there was also something in that house, even while the couple that lived there were both alive. As told to me by this same witness, this house was the first house built in this subdivision back in 1959. I wonder now, what was it built over? Believe me when I say that there was much, much more that happened in that house that I did not cover. So much, in fact, that I always thought about writing about it as a book. My own tests and traps that I set up to try to document proof were kind of crazy too. I went so far as dusting the metal dome of the touch lamp with flour just to see if there would ever be any prints. Running thread the same color of the carpet an inch from the floor across my son's doorway, so that it was almost unseen, hoping to see the string snapped from whatever was entering my son's room at night. Never got a dang thing. It has been years since I lived there, and this house is very close to my son's mother's house. The times that I have to go over there, to my ex's house, I make it a point to drive by this place. There are new tenants there. Well, not new, as they lived there since shortly after I moved out. I always wonder if they too are having experiences there. Ghosts are real. Hauntings are real. I think and believe that because both my son and I both had very close calls with almost dying. Another story for another time. That this made us more susceptible and open to the entities in that house. Anyway, this story is all true. The house is real. I do not know if the new tenants have had any experiences, and I see no reason to go back to that house and find out. I hope you believe. When I was in primary school, I went to an old school. I don't remember a lot. One day I was in after school care. My mom comes to pick me up. I forgot something in my classroom. There were doors always unlocked. So I go to get it. I'm in the classroom and I look around. Something felt off. This sounds fake, but it did happen. The plant pot falls to the ground. I pause and start crying as I run away. I knew that pot wasn't anywhere near the edge of the desk. I heard from good friends that they did experience weird stuff like that at our old school. It was most likely haunted. My girlfriend had a grandmother who she was really close to growing up. In 2014, she passed away from cancer, and it took a large mental toll on my girlfriend. Her grandmother was one of the main figures in her life, providing wisdom, helping her out when she was stuck, and always looking over her to make sure she was okay. As the years passed, my girlfriend said she could always sense her grandmother was still watching over her, and would appear in dreams or manifest as a strong gut feeling. Having past experiences with the paranormal, I thought it was sweet and endearing her grandmother was still watching over her in the afterlife. I didn't think much more than that at the time. The first real sign there was more to what she was feeling came in 2019. My girlfriend's best friend and roommate at the time wanted to try Reiki. It's a Japanese technique to try to reduce stress. Together, as they were both highly stressed trying to get jobs post-graduation. During the process, my girlfriend could sense her grandmother was in the room, but couldn't see her. Later that night, the roommate had a dream of an elderly woman saying a name. In the morning, when she told my girlfriend, there was silence as the woman's description matched that of my girlfriend's grandma. This could have been chalked up to seeing an old photo of them together, which my girlfriend had plenty of on her phone. The part that made indicated there was more afoot was the name. It was a nickname that the grandmother would call my girlfriend when she visited. My girlfriend never told anyone the nickname. That same day, my girlfriend got a phone call from a company that concluded with her getting her first job out of college. My experience with her grandma came in 2021. It was a similar story as above, where my girlfriend was trying to acquire a position that would elevate her in her career. Her current company at the time did some major restructuring, which resulted in poorer management and toxic work environments. She was praying and asking for something to show a sign that all her efforts to get out of the company and go someplace better were not for naught. She was on the hunt for the last 6 months and was about to give up. That night, she withdrew her normal bubbly personality and was visibly upset. I told her that things do take time, and the biggest piece was to keep pushing forward, no matter how many hurdles are thrown your way. It did cheer her up, just in time to go to bed. It should be noted at this point, we live in a 2-bedroom apartment on the 3rd floor with large windows, and a bedroom that gets flooded with light from the city streets and surrounding buildings. There are curtains that are drawn across to prevent the light from getting in, but the occasional car headlight will peep through. As we settled into bed, my mind was plagued with an all too familiar feeling that I experienced once before, when I chased down an old ghost story at an old tobacco barn in my hometown. I couldn't help shake the feeling that something was watching us. I first gazed over to the windows to make sure it wasn't some person that was peeking through the gaps in the blind. It was when I scanned the room that I noticed what appeared to be a shadow in the corner in the front of the door. It was like a thick black mist with no identifying features that stood there, like it was standing guard. I froze briefly before convincing myself that I must be dreaming and just laid back down. In the morning, my girlfriend startled me awake by telling me she got a call from a large consulting firm looking to recruit her. She was so happy and couldn't stop dancing. I was glad she got the new role that she was looking for, but I couldn't stop thinking about what I saw right before I went to bed. I proceeded to inquire if she had any strange dreams last night, to which she responded with a giddy yes. She proceeded to tell me it was about her grandma, and her walking on a beach reminiscing about old stories, and her grandma was parting advice to her about the future. At that point, I told her what I saw, and she told me, "Oh, you saw her as well. I thought it was just my imagination." Now I know whenever my girlfriend is stuck or having a hard time, expect a visit from Grandma. This might not be a scary encounter of mine, but it was something that will remain with me forever. It was the 45th day of my mom's passing away, and in our culture, it is believed that the soul stays in the house till that time, and then they leave. So I was sleeping in the living room for the entire time after my mom's passing. I felt a hand go from my head slowly through my body to my toes, slowly dragging her fingers across. As soon as it reached my toes, I woke up. And I know it wasn't a dream. And you know the state where you're kind of awake and you can feel your surroundings? Yeah, I was in that state. So I feel to this day, my mom was there to say her last goodbye to me. She loved me dearly and worried about me too much. I miss her oh so much to this day. She passed away in September of 2009 with a brain hemorrhage. I just wanted to share this with you all and discuss if any of you had any such experiences. Thank you for reading. One of my good friends in high school had this lake house. It was given to his parents by their grandparents, and they lived in this house from 90 to 93. One day in 93, his mom woke him and his younger sister up and left the house. Mind you, it was 2 to 3 a.m. They went to a restaurant that was open 24/7, stayed there until sunrise, and then went home, packed all of their clothing and other important things and left the house. They never went back, and his mother will not talk about what happened, They still own this property. It has 2 homes on it and is a lakefront, probably worth millions. The power is still on, and his dad comes and checks on it every so often. So in hearing that story, we of course went to the lake house. Pulling up a motion sensor floodlight flicked on and stayed on. We unlocked the deadbolt, which requires a key to open on both sides, and walked in. Instantly, you got that creepy feeling like someone was watching you. We walked around for about a half an hour, walking up the stairs and unlocking another door with a deadbolt on both sides. And man, was it eerie. All the furniture still set up, his sister's nursery still intact, and a tea kettle still on the stove. Just straight up creepy in every way. Finally, we go to leave and decide to go through the garage. I have the keys, and again, you had to have a key to unlock it from the inside. I'm trying to open the door and turn around to get a light, just in time to see a rock come from somewhere down the hall and hit my foot. Staring at all 3 of my friends and not seeing them do anything with their arm or legs or anything else, I decide to try and unlock the door more rapidly. Finally, I find the right key and put it in the keyhole. As soon as I do, the garage door opens up about 2 feet, and thanks to the motion sensor floodlight that's still on, I can see a chair in the garage. The chair proceeds to be thrown against the wall with a violence that I can't describe, and the garage door is slammed shut. I turn around to say let's get the hell out of here, and see a rock come from the darkness and hit the wall with a lot more force right next to my head. At this point, I'm done. We run back to the stairs down to the basement, and for safety of the door we came in. The door, which requires a key on either side to lock or unlock, and we left unlocked, is now locked. Freaking out, hearing what sounds like heavy running footsteps upstairs, I am panicking to find the key. Finally, I find it and unlock the door. We run to the next door, and you guessed it, locked. I again find the right key as the footsteps are getting louder and coming down the stairs. We run out the door, and it gets left open by the last person out. And then as we go to shut it, the door is slammed shut, and instantly you hear the deadbolt get locked. At this point, we're only focusing on getting out of this place. We run to the truck, and all 4 of us pile in. And as soon as the truck starts, every single light in the house comes on at once. My buddy slams it into reverse, and we are flying down this very long driveway. And as soon as our tires leave the gravel and hit the pavement, every light in the house turns off, leaving it in absolute darkness. Something very bad is in that house. I'm not sure what, but I'll never go back. And I absolutely believe in ghosts, demons, etc. Believe it or not, this is the short version of this story, and the backstory of the house is even creepier. I grew up Catholic and began questioning my faith around the age of 14. It was a dark time for me, and I believe that because I was vulnerable, something took the opportunity to harass me, for lack of a better word. When I was about 14, I started having dreams that felt different from the others. In the beginning, there was always a man. He was very handsome, tall with black hair and ice blue eyes. He was very comforting to me, and would give me advice about specific things in my life. I looked forward to dreaming about this man. Then, as I continued having these dreams, he started acting a bit different. He would say things that made me question his motives, things that just didn't seem right, like a friend pretending to compliment you, but really making fun of you. I started getting uncomfortable with it. Eventually, he started telling me all these things to do that would help me, things like killing people who have hurt me, or killing myself so that I can be happy. He became angry with me when I disagreed. When I would dream about him, I would always feel the same sense of deep dread and horror. It was intense fear that I would feel as soon as a dream began, and I knew he was there. In one particular dream, he chased me through the streets of what looked like a dark, gloomy city from the early 1900s. He was trying to kill me. I started saying the Lord's Prayer and woke up immediately. This is when it got really bad. I never saw him as the handsome man after that point. He took the form of people I loved and said horrible things to me. I was told how worthless I was and to unalive myself. Most commonly, he was my mother saying these things. My mother was abusive and we had a very bad relationship. Each time this would happen, I would pray, and usually I would wake up. After some time, that became less effective. Every time I would pray, I felt like I was being choked, or that I couldn't breathe or move my mouth. Nonetheless, I would continue waking up. All of this happened over probably 100 dreams from the ages of 14 to 19, when I moved into my own apartment. I had one last dream there, and since then, it's stopped. I'm 21 now. I think that because I continued praying and staying confident in defending myself, it became less fun for whatever that thing was, and it left me. I hope that I never feel that feeling at the beginning of a dream again. Edit. If anyone wants to know any specifics of what this thing said and did, I'll be glad to tell. Just ask. Update. So a lot of people have been asking me what the conversations were like, so I'll elaborate a little bit here. I can't remember everything perfectly, but in the beginning, it told me I could do anything and that I had big potential. I would always smile and thank him in the dreams. It made me feel really good at the time, but looking back, I'm sure it was trying to play on my ego to get me to do things it wanted me to do later on. Once it got malicious, it said a few specific things that I can remember vividly because they were very upsetting to me. One time, it was my mom standing over me, burning me with a cigarette all over my body. She was a heavy smoker. She was basically just telling me I was worthless and that she hated me and to unalive myself. I knew it was a part of this thing's agenda because of that dread feeling that I always got. It was a horrible feeling every time I would dream about that thing. I can't stress it enough. Another time, it pretended to be a guy that I was in love with at the time. Let's call him Josh. 2 Joshes walked into my apartment, and then one of them went back downstairs. I asked the remaining one if he was the real Josh, to which he replied no. I asked him where the real Josh was going, and with a disgusting smile, he said, "Everywhere." And with that, I heard a gunshot and saw a bullet hole appear in the floor at my feet. Blood splattered around the hole, and the Josh in front of me laughed this hideous, evil laugh that I'll never forget. Again, that feeling was there. I woke up crying. That one stuck with me for a while. Another time, I began dreaming that my current boyfriend was propped up over the top of me in bed, and we were kissing. After a while, he said, "I'm so glad that you're you and I'm me." But he said it in a creepy tone of voice that insinuated that it was not my boyfriend who was on top of me. I started laughing, and then I felt my actual boyfriend turning over in the bed next to me sleeping. That one was terrifying. Those are the most notable ones that I can really remember. Before I moved to London, I used to live in a 1950s built house in Hampshire, UK. My parents had purchased it in 1999 from an old couple who had lived in it since it was built, so no one had died in it. The first strange thing that happened was the cats wouldn't stay in the house. They would always bolt out for some reason. After my parents started renovating, my brother and I both started to feel like we were being watched in the house. And at night in the living room, you would always feel like something was watching you through the new glass doors from the hallway or the stairs. After a while, if we were sitting downstairs, we would start to hear footsteps moving from my bedroom in the room above, walking to my brother's neighboring room, then across the landing to the hallway to my parents' room. My parents both dismissed it as the pipes cooling or the floorboards settling, but you could distinctly tell what boards the footsteps were treading on. At one point, friends came over. I was alone. And as you walked down the street, you could see into our living room. They asked if I had relatives staying, as they had seen people sitting on the sofa. Things started to move. You'd place shoes by the door, and then they'd be under the stairs, or things like keys would be moved somewhere else. Then it gets really creepy. One day I had run a bath and was listening to music on the computer in the study in the next room. It had been a while and the music had stopped as the PC had gone into standby mode. I had been in the bath about an hour and fell asleep, and as the water had just gotten past my nose, the music on the PC shot back on louder and woke me up. Bearing in mind, in those days you had to mash the keyboard or really jiggle the mouse to wake up the computer, saving me from potentially drowning. I took this to be whatever was in that house wasn't bad. However, a few weeks later I woke up, bolt upright like something had woken me up. Must have been around 2 a.m. My door was open on the landing, and it was a bright full moon night, shining through the hallway onto the brick landing. I looked, and to my terror I saw an old man, but he wasn't standing up. It was like he was lying down on the stairs, and his head was at foot height, staring around the landing wall, directly at me. The moonlight was on his face. It haunts me to this day. I closed the door and slept with my light on for the rest of the night. My parents sold the house in 2004 when they moved to New Zealand, and when I spoke to my dad about it later, he said he knew something was in the house, but hadn't wanted to scare my brother and I. He'd had his own experiences. He'd heard the same footsteps on the floorboards, and in the mornings when he'd get up and make tea for Mom, he'd hear footsteps behind him in the kitchen walking towards him, something brushing past him, and the taps would turn on by themselves. Years later, when I told him about the old man that I'd seen, he said on a few occasions he'd been in the lounge at night, and in the reflection of his reading glasses, he could see the exact same man sitting in the armchair behind him. My dad is a massive skeptic, a policeman back in the day and a no-nonsense project director. Apparently, he was so freaked out, he went to the public records office to see what our house had been built on. The area had been made up of old mansion estates back in the Victorian times, and it looked like our kitchen had been built over a pathway leading from the old big house to an ice house outbuilding. He thinks maybe it was the servants, or whoever walked that path. Very spooky. I have a few family members that used to live in Mississippi, and the few of the houses in these different towns were haunted. For the sake of my family's privacy, I won't be naming the towns. Every summer in the early 2000s for about 4 years, my childhood summer vacation would be predictable. Let's go see insert family member's name in Mississippi, and I dreaded it. It wasn't that I didn't want to go see them. It was the heat. The almost unbearable hot Mississippi heat and the stench of something rotten on the wind whenever it blew by. Pretty sure it was the Mississippi mud, though. Also, there was really not much at all to do in these two different towns the times we went to Mississippi. The library or the park. Take your pick. Also, the traveling distance from our home to these towns was long, and it was a cramped car ride with other family. I'll start with the first house in the first town that I remember visiting when we would visit. First off, the vibes were off. Being in the place, you had a funny feeling of not being wanted. Said family member married a guy that already had kids that were grown and still living with them, but her husband and his kids did not like us being there. I can't say I liked them either, but we only seen said family member once a year, so they had to deal. But it wasn't just her stepkids and husband that were off. The whole place felt off. My grandma stayed in the stepsister's room while she stayed, I believe, at her mom's house the week we were there. There was this long hallway that connected two rooms, her room and another room. It was like a closet/storage space. But I would always think that that was a very weird thing, a closed hallway that connected two rooms, and it was built that way. I've never heard of another room having this feature apart from really old houses. This house wasn't very old. It was built, I'm guessing, in the late 80s. Well, my grandma heard scratching from behind that door, like someone was in there scratching with their nails. Also, my family member we visited. Her and her husband's room was the other room connected, and she heard it. And it scared her so bad she put a heavy trunk and other junk in front of her door, so that way nothing could come out. If I remember right, those doors also had locks, so they stayed locked. The family member we visited, she had also seen things in that house before we got there. Things that would make the hair stand on end. She says she's seen something that looked like Gollum from Lord of the Rings crawling on the ceiling, looking right at her while she was in bed with her husband, in the dim light. And it scared her really bad. Beside this fireplace in the living room, on both sides was openings, doorways to go into the kitchen. So basically 2 open ways that lead from the living room to the kitchen. My mom was walking the length behind the fireplace where the kitchen was. My grandma said in the first doorway she saw her as a little girl skipping along out of the corner of her eye, wearing a pink, frilly, old-timey dress and blonde curled hair. And this little girl was skipping. When my mom made it to the other doorway, it was my mom again, not the little girl. Suddenly, Mom told Grandma. Just then, I had the weirdest feeling. I felt like I was a little girl again, with not a care in the world. Then Grandma said, "You're not going to believe this, but I saw you as a little girl." Needless to say, they were both freaked out. The little girl that Grandma saw did not look like Mom when she was little, but I believed what happened was a ghost of a little girl possessed my mother for a few seconds. Just recently, I showed a bunch of old-timey pictures of girls' dresses to my grandma to try and narrow down the timeline that girl was from. I put together a drawing of how my grandma described her, but I'll post that later. She said it looks exactly like what she had seen. There was a sunroom in the house. This happened only one time, but there was sounds of something banging. Like literally, someone was in there throwing crap in that room, like lawn chairs or whatever. Everyone went to check and there was nothing. Nobody. Mom and Grandma slept with the lights on, ceiling lights, all night. Matter of fact, they barely slept. The story behind that house was that the guy that had it before them, well, his wife went missing. Gone. And I think people thought for while he murdered her and hid the body. On the property? Who knows? A few years later, our family member and her wonderful stepkids and husband moved to another house in a different town. This I do remember. Late at night when everyone was in bed, we all heard something roll up and down the hallway like a ball. My family member's daughter had a little tricycle that she rode around in the house, so that was maybe what we heard. We only heard it one night, but it was enough. I can't really remember what else happened in that house, but I'm sure there were other things. After a few years, the summers in Mississippi stopped. Another chapter closed in my childhood. Said family member got divorced and moved her and her daughter, and we've never been back to Mississippi since. I grew up in the 90s in Minnesota. My parents divorced when I was 8, and we spent every other weekends at my dad's haunted house in East Bethel. This house had every type of ghost you could think of. A shadow man in a trench coat and brimmed hat. Another separate shadow figure that danced down the hallway. A man dressed to go fishing. A doppelganger of my father. 2 giggling little girl ghosts. And many other unseen entities. The dishwasher, radios, and lights would turn themselves on and off randomly. Loud banging would be heard on walls and doors. Door handles would jiggle and turn on their own. Feelings of being touched or caressed in the shower were reported. My father also had an incident where he felt someone crawl into bed with him in the middle of the night, when he was the only one home. My uncle reported hearing 2 little girls giggling and singing in the basement one night while sleeping downstairs. Upon awakening the next morning, he discovered there were no kids in the house that night. Also, there was a salamander plague one night. The entire yard was covered in slimy, slithering salamanders. It only ever happened once. Not sure if that's paranormal, but it's certainly strange. One sunny Saturday morning while visiting my dad, My brother and I were up early watching cartoons. I was 8 years old and my brother was 3. As we sat on the couch, we heard 3 knocking sounds on the wall 5 to 6 feet behind us. Knock. 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 Our heads quickly snapped to look at the wall where the sound was coming from, but we saw nothing. My brother and I quickly turned to look at each other with frightened eyes. I, being the older sister, tried to be brave. I told him it was nothing. As we turn our attention back to the cartoons, my little 8-year-old brain was spinning. What if that banging noise we just heard wasn't just the pipes, as I had been told so many times? What if it was a ghost? I hate when the ghosts come around. Why isn't my dad around whenever this happens? As these knocks swirl in my head, we hear it again. Knock. 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 This time it is coming from somewhere in the kitchen off to our left. It's not as loud as the first time, and the sound is different. Like someone is knocking on the kitchen counter this time instead of the wall. We quickly strain our necks to peek inside the kitchen, with lightning speed to catch whomever or whatever is making that noise. Again, there is nothing there. I take a deep breath. Once again, I pretend to be brave and tell my brother, "It's nothing. Just ignore it." My heart is thumping in my chest and there are butterflies in my tummy as the familiar anxiety grows worse with each passing second. I tuck myself up on the couch in a ball, not wanting my legs to dangle off the edge. I no longer feel safe. Nothing is to be trusted. Knock. 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 This time, the sound is coming from the dining room. I can tell the noise is coming from the wooden dining table this time. I can see the entire table from where I am sitting with ease, and there is nothing on the table that should be making that noise. No one except for me and my brother are awake. There is no one in the dining room. There is no logical reason for this knocking noise that is moving around us. Just then, I realize the knocking sounds have been moving in a big circle around us. If this invisible entity is to move any closer to us, the next logical place for it to be would be in the living room where me and my brother are currently sitting. No sooner than thought crossed my mind, it happened again. Knock. 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 This time the noise was coming from the coffee table sitting less than 1 foot away from us. I instantly flip over the back of my couch in a reverse somersault-like motion and run at a superhuman speed to my father's bedroom. In my panic, I completely left my little 3-year-old brother behind to fend for himself. Luckily, he wasn't too far behind. We sneak into our father's room and quietly lay on the floor. Our dad would have been super pissed if we woke him up early in the Saturday morning, even for a ghost. In our commotion, we wake up our 6-year-old sister, who was sleeping on our dad's floor. Us 3 kids always slept on his floor together when we were visiting. So we quietly whisper what just happened out in the living room to our sister. As we're telling her this story, something catches our eye. We can see a black shadow under the small space between the bottom of the door and the plush carpet. This black shadow is slowly pacing back and forth in the hallway, just on the other side of the bedroom door. Back and forth. Back and forth. Back and forth. Like this shadow is waiting for us. Unfortunately, I don't remember what happened after this point. Somehow the rest of that memory has been lost with time. But I know for sure that we did not open that door. As an adult, I often wish that I would have been brave and opened the door. What would have been waiting? Would the entity have entered the room and attacked? Would we have been shocked and confused to find the hallway empty? Would the gray shadow just keep pacing the hallway, oblivious to our frightened, curious eyes? If you get this far, thank you for reading my story. I can't wait to read your comments. I've shared this story specifically on a few podcasts. This was one of my 3 of my personal scariest experiences living in that house. I've done a lot of research on the home and property over the years, and can't find any evidence of a death or tragedy that would account for so much paranormal activity. I've also reached out to a previous and current owner to see if they had any strange experiences. The 2 families who lived there previously said they never had any strange experiences. Neither did the family who lived there right after my family. The family currently living there did not respond to my questions, and in hindsight, I regret even asking them. It wasn't cool of me to even put that thought in their head. Prior to the home being built, all I can find is that the land the house sits on was part of a farm for a family that I could find very little information on. So was my family haunted? Were we all suffering from 12 plus years of mass hysteria? Thank you so much for listening to the stories in this video. I hope that you all have an excellent rest of your night, and I hope you enjoyed the stories. I hope you also enjoy the extra rain at the end of this video. Good night, everybody.